The evening began like any other, a casual dinner among close friends. Ava's husband, Daniel, had invited his longtime best friend, Mark, over for a quiet meal at their home. It was nothing out of the ordinary. They had done this countless times before. Yet, for some reason, something about tonight felt different. Ava couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the sensation had been creeping up on her for weeks now. Maybe it was the way Mark's gaze seemed to linger on her a second too long, or how his laughter carried a warmth that felt a little too personal when he responded to her jokes. She tried to dismiss it. "I'm just imagining things." Mark arrived right on time, as always. He stepped inside with his usual easy charm, holding a bottle of wine in one hand, flashing a smile that made Ava's stomach twist for reasons she didn't want to examine. "Evening, Ava," he greeted, his voice deep and smooth. She forced a polite smile. "Evening, Mark. Dinner's almost ready. Make yourself comfortable." Daniel clapped his friend on the shoulder with enthusiasm, pulling him into a firm handshake that turned into a brotherly hug. "Good to see you, man. Feels like it's been forever." Mark chuckled. "Only 2 weeks, but sure, let's go with that." The three of them had a shared history spanning over a decade. Mark wasn't just Daniel's best friend, he was like family. But tonight, as he settled onto their couch, there was something in his expression, something unreadable that sent a ripple of unease through Ava. He seemed to watch her in the quiet moments, only looking away when Daniel turned his attention back to him. Dinner started off normally enough. The conversation flowed easily, laughter punctuating the air as they reminisced about the past. Mark was a natural storyteller, spinning tales that had Daniel roaring with laughter. Ava laughed along, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was at the center of something unspoken. It became even more apparent after dinner. Daniel excused himself to grab dessert from the kitchen, leaving Ava and Mark alone at the table. The moment stretched, heavier than it should have been. Mark leaned back slightly in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass. His dark eyes met hers, lingering in a way that made her pulse quicken. "Ava," he murmured, his voice low, almost hesitant. "You look different tonight." Her breath caught. "Different?" she repeated, keeping her tone light. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head, a small smirk playing on his lips. "I don't know. You just seem radiant." Before she could respond, Daniel's voice broke through the tension as he returned, holding a plate of cheesecake. Mark straightened instantly, slipping back into his usual easygoing demeanor. But the words hung in the air between them, unshakable. And for the first time, Ava realized something had shifted, and she wasn't sure she could ignore it anymore. Ava barely tasted the dessert. The rich sweetness of the cheesecake melted on her tongue, but her mind was somewhere else, looping Mark's words over and over. "You seem radiant." On the surface, it was just a compliment. Something casual, something harmless. But the way he said it, the way his eyes had held hers, made it feel like something else entirely. Daniel, blissfully unaware, was chatting away, cutting into his slice of cheesecake, occasionally cracking jokes that made Mark laugh. But Ava felt like she was trapped in a silent, unspoken conversation. She glanced at Mark from across the table. He wasn't looking at her now, not directly, but she could feel the weight of his attention, the quiet pull between them that had been growing stronger with every passing moment. Was she imagining it? Number. The way he spoke to her, the way he watched her when he thought no one else noticed, it was real. And that terrified her. "Remember that road trip where Daniel insisted he knew a shortcut and we ended up in the middle of nowhere?" Mark suddenly said, smirking as he leaned back in his chair. Daniel groaned. "Oh, come on. I did eventually get us back on track." "Yeah, 3 hours later," Mark countered, grinning. He turned to Ava, his voice playful. "What about you, Ava?" Got any good Daniel stories? I'm sure you have some embarrassing ones saved up. Ava hesitated. It was such a harmless question, just banter between friends. But the way Mark was looking at her made it feel like something else. She forced a small laugh. Plenty, she admitted, keeping her tone light. But I think I'll save them for the right moment. Can't let Daniel have all the fun. Daniel chuckled, completely oblivious to the way Mark's gaze lingered on her for a second longer than necessary. Ava took a sip of her wine, willing her pulse to slow down. The night carried on, conversations shifting, laughter continuing. But beneath it all, there was something simmering. Something neither of them dared to acknowledge out loud. It was a game, wasn't it? A dangerous, unspoken game. And for the first time, Ava wasn't sure if she wanted to play it, or run from it. The night wound down, but the tension didn't. Mark finally stood by the door, preparing to leave. Daniel clapped him on the back. You know you're always welcome here, man. Same time next week? Wouldn't miss it, Mark said, his usual confident grin in place. Ava stood beside Daniel, her polite smile locked in place, but her mind was elsewhere. Mark turned to her. Thanks for dinner, Ava. You always make it feel like home. His voice was warm, steady, but there was something else beneath the words, something only she could hear. Anytime, she replied, careful to keep her tone neutral. Mark's gaze lingered for just a beat too long. Not enough for Daniel to notice, but enough for Ava to feel it in her bones. And then, just like that, he was gone. The door clicked shut, and the house fell into silence. Daniel stretched, yawning. Man, I'm exhausted. You coming to bed? In a minute, Ava murmured. Just going to clean up a little. Daniel nodded, placing a quick kiss on her cheek before heading upstairs. Ava exhaled slowly, running a hand through her hair. The room felt different now, quieter, heavier. Like Mark's presence still lingered in the air. She moved through the kitchen, tidying up the dishes, but her mind was racing. Was she reading too much into things? Maybe she had imagined the way Mark looked at her. Maybe it was just friendly admiration, nothing more. But then, her phone buzzed on the counter. Ava's heart lurched. She reached for it, half expecting to see Mark's name. She was right. Mark. Thanks again for tonight. Always a pleasure seeing you. That should have been innocent enough. But her pulse quickened as she read the next line. Mark. You looked amazing tonight, by the way. Ava's breath hitched. Her fingers hovered over the screen. 1,000 responses ran through her mind, from polite dismissal to something much riskier. Instead, she set the phone face down on the counter. As if that could erase what had just happened. As if that could silence the part of her that wondered what would happen if she responded. Ava barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Daniel's steady breathing filled the room. She should have felt comforted by his presence, but instead, she felt restless. Her mind was tangled in something she didn't want to name. Mark's message. Those words sat heavy in her chest. You looked amazing tonight. She had ignored it. She had left it unanswered. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Because she was still thinking about it. Because part of her had wanted to respond. She rolled onto her side, facing away from Daniel. Her phone was still on the nightstand, screen dark. It would be so easy to reach for it, to type something simple. Thanks. Glad you came over? See you next week. None of those words would have been wrong, but she knew, deep down, what they would mean. So she stayed still, and eventually, sleep took her. Morning arrived with bright sunlight streaming through the blinds. Daniel was already up, moving around the bedroom, buttoning up his shirt. Morning, sleepyhead, he teased, leaning down to kiss her forehead. Ava forced a smile. Morning. You okay? He asked, his brow furrowing slightly. You were tossing and turning all night. Just a weird dream, she lied. Daniel nodded, not pressing further. I have a long day at work, but I should be home by 7. You want to do takeout tonight? Yeah, she said, pushing the covers back and sitting up. Sounds good. He grinned. Perfect. See you later, babe. He grabbed his keys and left, whistling on his way out the door. Ava waited until she heard his car pull away before she reached for her phone. She shouldn't have, but she did. Mark's message was still there. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She took a deep breath, and then, against her better judgment, she typed, "Thanks, Mark. That was sweet of you to say." A second passed, then another. Then, the 3 little dots appeared. Mark was already replying. Her heart pounded as she watched them blink on the screen, knowing she had just stepped closer to a line she wasn't sure she could step back from. Ava held her breath as Mark's message appeared. Mark. Only the truth. You really did look beautiful last night. Her fingers tensed around the phone. She shouldn't respond. She knew she shouldn't. But her heart was hammering in a way that felt unfamiliar, thrilling, and dangerous. Her mind raced through a dozen possible replies. She could brush it off, keep it light, pretend like it was nothing. Or she could say something reckless, something she couldn't take back. She settled for the safest middle ground she could find. Ava. That's kind of you to say, but I don't think Daniel would appreciate you noticing. It was her way of setting a boundary. A gentle reminder. But Mark's response came almost instantly. Mark. I wasn't complimenting Daniel. Ava swallowed hard. Her thumb hovered over the screen, hesitating. Before she could type anything, another message came through. Mark. But if this makes you uncomfortable, I'll stop. She exhaled. There it was. The exit. The way out. She could tell him yes, stop. They could pretend this never happened, go back to normal, keep things easy and safe. But instead, she hesitated. Because deep down, she didn't want him to stop. Instead of ending it, she typed, Ava. I think we both know this is complicated. The moment she hit send, her stomach twisted with nerves. Mark's response was slower this time, as if he was choosing his words carefully. Mark. Complicated doesn't always mean wrong. Ava stared at the words, feeling the weight of them settle over her. Something had shifted. This wasn't harmless anymore. This was something else. Something she wasn't sure she was ready to name. Ava spent the rest of the morning pretending nothing had changed. She folded laundry, cleaned the kitchen, scrolled through her phone mindlessly. Anything to keep herself from thinking too much. But it didn't work. Mark's words echoed in her mind. Complicated doesn't always mean wrong. She hated how much she was thinking about them. How much she was thinking about him. A few hours passed. She didn't respond. She shouldn't respond. Then, in the early afternoon, another message appeared. Mark. Lunch? Just to talk. Ava's pulse quickened. This was it. The moment she could shut this down completely. She could say no. She could ignore it. She could do the right thing. But her fingers moved on their own. Ava. Where? The reply came fast. Mark. That little cafe near the park. 1 o'clock? Ava stared at the screen. This was a mistake. She knew that. But she still typed. Ava. Okay. She set her phone down and rubbed her temples. What was she doing? She told herself it was innocent. It was just lunch. Friends had lunch all the time. But something about it felt different. Something about it felt like the first real mistake. She took extra care getting ready. Not too much makeup, just a little. Not too dressy, but not too casual either. She told herself it was normal. She wasn't doing this for Mark. But deep down, she wasn't sure she believed that. By the time she arrived at the cafe, he was already there, waiting for her by the window. He smiled when he saw her. A slow, knowing smile. Ava's stomach twisted, but she ignored it and walked inside. The moment she sat down, she knew this wasn't just lunch, and they both knew it. Ava sat across from Mark, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She told herself to act normal, to keep this light, to pretend this was nothing more than two old friends catching up. But the air between them was charged. Mark leaned back in his chair, studying her. Not in a way that was obvious, not in a way that anyone else would notice, but in a way that made her heart pound. "You almost didn't come," he said finally. Ava forced a small smile. "I thought about canceling." "But you didn't." She exhaled, stirring her coffee even though she hadn't added sugar. "It's just lunch, right?" Mark's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "If that's what you want it to be." She hesitated, then took a sip of her coffee, using the moment to compose herself. She needed to get a grip. "This is Mark, Daniel's best friend. The same person who has been at our dinner table 100 times before. But it didn't feel the same." "So," she said, keeping her voice even. "What did you want to talk about?" Mark's lips curved slightly. "You, mostly." Ava's chest tightened. "Mark, relax," he said, lifting his hands in surrender. "No pressure, no expectations, just honesty." Ava wasn't sure she wanted honesty, because honesty meant acknowledging something she wasn't ready to admit. Still, she found herself asking, "And what exactly do you want me to be honest about?" Mark leaned forward slightly. "That you feel it too." The words hit her harder than she expected. She wanted to deny it. She should deny it. But her throat felt tight. Instead of answering, she glanced away, out the window, watching the people passing by on the sidewalk, oblivious to the quiet storm building inside her. Mark didn't press. He just let the moment settle between them. After a long pause, he exhaled and leaned back again. "Look, Ava, I don't want to make your life complicated, but I also don't want to pretend." Her gaze snapped back to his. "Pretend what?" "That something isn't happening here." Ava's stomach flipped. A part of her wanted to stand up, walk away, shut this door before it opened any wider. But another part, the part that had responded to his message, the part that had dressed a little more carefully this morning, the part that was still sitting here, wanted to stay. She swallowed hard. "And if I say there isn't something happening?" Mark gave her a slow, knowing look. "I'd say that's your call to make." The way he said it sent a shiver through her. Because deep down, she knew. He was right. And the choice was hers. Ava knew she should leave. She should push back her chair, mumble an excuse, and walk out of this cafe before she did something she'd regret. But she didn't. Instead, she sat there, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as she stared at Mark, her mind racing. This was a moment she would remember. A crossroads. One path led back to safety, back to Daniel, back to the life she had built. The other led somewhere she wasn't sure she could come back from. Mark must have sensed her hesitation because he softened. "Ava, I'm not asking for anything. I don't want to lie to myself anymore." A lump formed in her throat. It would have been easier if he had been pushy, if he had tried to manipulate her. But he wasn't. He was just there, waiting for her to decide. Ava exhaled slowly. "This isn't fair to Daniel." Mark nodded. "I know." Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She could still stop this. But instead of standing, instead of saying goodbye, she reached for her coffee, took another slow sip, and let the silence between them stretch. Mark didn't rush her. He just watched. And in that moment, Ava realized the truth. She had already made her choice. Even if she hadn't said it out loud, even if she never did. Something between them had shifted, and there was no going back.